In the heart of ancient Israel, where faith fluctuated between worship of the true God and idolatry, Elijah the Tishbite emerges not just as a prophet, but as a standard of true faith amidst widespread apostasy. His introduction, as described in 1 Kings 17, is abrupt but laden with prophetic significance. Elijah presents himself before King Ahab, not for dialogue, but to announce divine judgment in direct response to the endemic idolatry led by Ahab and his queen Jezebel. Israel's idolatry had reached its apex with the worship of Baal, a Canaanite deity associated with rain and fertility, provoking divine wrath. Elijah the Tishbite, from Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word." 1 Kings 17:1. This verse not only establishes Elijah as an instrument of God, but also highlights his courage and the severity of divine judgment. The announced drought is both literal and symbolic, reflecting not just the absence of water, but also Israel's spiritual dryness. God's response to Elijah's faith and obedience is immediately evident. In a period where survival becomes a daily challenge, God provides for Elijah in miraculous ways. "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there." 1 Kings 17:3, 4. This passage not only underscores divine providence, but also the unique relationship between God and Elijah. The ravens, unclean creatures according to Levitical law, become vehicles of God's grace, bringing bread and meat to the prophet, thus challenging conventional notions of purity and sanctity. The Kerith ravine serves not just as a physical refuge for Elijah, but also as a setting for the manifestation of divine care. Even when the brook dries up, a symbol of the worsening drought over Israel, God already has a plan to continue providing for his servant, guiding him next to a widow in Zarephath. This transition highlights a fundamental truth about God's character. Even in the most challenging circumstances, he prepares a way for the provision and protection of those who are faithful to him. The account of Elijah and the drought in Israel transcends the historical event, offering eternal lessons on faithfulness, divine providence, and the importance of obedience. While Elijah remains one of the most powerful prophets of Israel, his story is a testament to God's power to sustain and protect those who boldly stand for truth, regardless of circumstances or consequences. The drought over Israel was both an act of judgment and a call to repentance, and divine provision for Elijah serves as a reminder that, even in times of great drought, be it physical, spiritual, or emotional, God continues to provide for his own. In the heart of a period of deep drought and famine, triggered by Elijah's prophetic word as judgment on Israel's idolatry, a miracle of provision and resurrection occurs, marking not just a turn in the life of a widow and her son, but also highlighting divine power and mercy. This episode, recorded in 1 Kings 17:8-24, is an eloquent testimony to how God intervenes in human desolation with actions of unfathomable grace. The narrative unfolds as God sends Elijah to Zarephath, a city outside the borders of Israel, to meet a widow on the brink of total despair. "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." 1 Kings 17:9. The choice of a widow in Zarephath, a Phoenician locality, is not trivial. It represents the reach of God's care beyond the borders of Israel, underscoring the universality of his compassion and provision. Upon arrival, Elijah finds the widow at a moment of extreme desolation. She was preparing to make one last meal for herself and her son before facing the death expected from hunger. The drought had not only dried up the land, but also the hopes of many, including this family. So he called to her and asked, "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" As she was going to get it, he called, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." 1 Kings 17:10-11. Elijah's response to the widow's desperate declaration reveals unwavering trust in God's power. Elijah promises that the widow's jar of flour and jug of oil would not run out until rain fell on the land again, a miracle of continuous provision that defies natural laws. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, "The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. 1 Kings 17:14. This miracle is a tangible demonstration of God's care, not just for Elijah, but also for those who welcome him. The subsequent miracle of the widow's son's resurrection further amplifies the manifestation of divine power. After the son's sudden death, the widow confronts Elijah, who takes the child, pleads with God for his life, and witnesses the boy's resurrection. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. 1 Kings 17:22. This act not only restores the son's life, but also strengthens the widow's faith in the God of Israel, underlining Elijah's divine authority and mission. In this setting, Elijah, the prophet of God, challenges the prophets of Baal to determine who serves the true God. This episode not only highlights Elijah's unwavering faith, but also serves as a powerful manifestation of God's sovereign power. Elijah proposes a direct challenge to the prophets of Baal, a contest not just to prove the non-existence of Baal's power, but also to reaffirm the authority of the God of Israel before a people who had strayed. He gathers the people of Israel and the prophets for a test on Mount Carmel, where 2 altars would be built, one for Baal and another for the Lord. Each side would call on their God, and the one who answered by fire from heaven would be shown to be the true God. Then Elijah said to them, "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God." 1 Kings 18:22-24. The prophets of Baal call on their God from morning till noon, without receiving any response. They dance and shout around the altar, even mutilating themselves in hope of an answer, but all is in vain. But there was no response, no one answered, no one paid attention. 1 Kings 18:29. When it's Elijah's turn, he rebuilds the altar of the Lord that had been torn down, using 12 stones, representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and prepares the sacrifice. Then, to further demonstrate God's supremacy, Elijah orders the altar to be drenched with water, making the challenge even more impossible by human standards. Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. 1 Kings 18:33. After this, Elijah prays to the Lord, asking God to reveal his glory and turn the people's hearts back to him. God's response is immediate and undeniable. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. 1 Kings 18:38. The divine demonstration is so powerful that the people immediately recognize the Lord's sovereignty, exclaiming, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" 1 Kings 18:39. This event is not just a triumph of Elijah's faith or a defeat of Baal's prophets, but a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness to His people and His sovereignty over all creation. The response of fire from heaven is a tangible demonstration of God's presence, not just consuming the sacrifice, but also burning the stones, the water, and the dust, symbolizing the purification and renewal of God's covenant with Israel. Following the decisive confrontation on Mount Carmel, 2 subsequent episodes highlight both the divine victory and Elijah's human vulnerability, the victory over Baal's prophets and his subsequent flight from Jezebel's vengeance. The overwhelming demonstration of God's power on Mount Carmel, where fire from heaven consumed Elijah's sacrifice, left the people of Israel with no doubts about who the true God was. This event culminated in Elijah's victory over the prophets of Baal. Driven by the people's reaction and the clear divine manifestation, Elijah orders the capture and execution of the false prophets, an act aimed at eradicating the corrupting influence of Baalist idolatry in Israel. Then Elijah commanded them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, don't let anyone get away." They seized them, and Elijah had them brought down to the Kishon Valley and slaughtered there. 1 Kings 18:40. This verse not only demonstrates the conclusion of God's victory over false gods, but also symbolizes Elijah's zeal for the restoration of worship to the Lord in Israel. Despite the phenomenal manifestation of divine power, and the victory over the prophets of Baal, Jezebel's reaction to the event reveals continued opposition to the God of Israel. Queen Jezebel, a fervent worshiper of Baal, vows vengeance for the death of her prophets, swearing to kill Elijah. This oath triggers a surprisingly human response in Elijah, leading him to flee for his life. Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the desert. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." 1 Kings 19, 3, 4. This moment of vulnerability in Elijah contrasts sharply with his earlier demonstration of faith and power, illustrating the complexity of human experience in the face of the divine and mortal danger. Elijah's flight and subsequent despair reflect not just personal fear, but also the pressure of being the lone bearer of divine truth in a context of hostility and apostasy. The contrast between the divine victory on Mount Carmel and Elijah's solitary flight highlights the dynamics between faith and doubt, courage and fear, characterizing the spiritual journey. After the monumental victory over the prophets of Baal and the subsequent flight from the mortal threat of Jezebel, Elijah finds himself exhausted, fearful and desperate, a state that leads him to plead for death. However, it is at this low point that he encounters God in an intimate and transformative manner. Reaching the limit of his physical and emotional endurance, Elijah takes refuge in the desert under a broom bush and prays to God to take his life. He prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." 1 Kings 19, 4. This moment reveals Elijah's vulnerability, starkly contrasting with the image of the courageous and unshakable prophet who faced the prophets of Baal. Elijah's honesty in expressing his despair before God reflects the depth of his relationship with the divine, where there is no room for false pretenses of strength or holiness. Elijah's despair leads him to Horeb, the mountain of God, where he seeks refuge in a cave. It is here that God meets with Elijah, not through powerful and spectacular natural manifestations like a great wind, an earthquake, or fire, but through a gentle whisper. After the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" 1 Kings 19:12-13. This intimate encounter with God not only reveals the personal and compassionate nature of God, but also serves to restore Elijah's vision and purpose. God's choice of a gentle and personal approach to communicate with Elijah at his moment of greatest vulnerability is profoundly significant. It underlines that God is not only a God of power and majesty, but also of gentleness and closeness. God acknowledges Elijah's exhaustion and despair and responds in a manner that brings comfort, clarity, and a renewed calling. This moment marks a turning point in Elijah's life, reorienting him from his despair to a renewed awareness of divine presence and purposes. God responds to Elijah's moment of vulnerability, not only with comfort, but also with new direction. "Go back the way you came and go to the desert of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael king over Aram. Also anoint Jehu son of Nimshi king over Israel, and anoint Elisha son of Shaphat from Abel-Meholah to succeed you as prophet." 1 Kings 19:15-16. These instructions represent a significant transition in Elijah's mission, broadening the scope of his prophetic activity beyond direct confrontation with idolatry to include the anointing of leaders who would play crucial roles in the future events of Israel and its neighboring nations. The designation of Hazael and Jehu as kings and the choice of Elisha as Elijah's successor symbolize significant political and spiritual changes orchestrated by God to realign and purify Israel and the surrounding nations. Each of these anointings carries profound implications for the fulfillment of divine purposes, demonstrating that even in times of apostasy, God actively works to restore and redeem. The transition of prophetic authority from Elijah to Elisha is one of the most emblematic moments in the Bible, filled with symbolism and meaning. So Elijah went up to Elisha and threw his cloak around him. 1 Kings 19:19. This symbolic act of throwing the cloak over Elisha was not just a way to call Elisha into prophetic ministry. It was an act of transferring authority, calling, and responsibility. Elisha's response, leaving his oxen and following Elijah, reflects the totality of his commitment to the divine call, marking the beginning of his journey as God's prophet. The choice of Elisha as Elijah's successor is not an end, but a new beginning. It represents the continuity of the prophetic mission in Israel, ensuring that God's voice would continue to be heard and his will proclaimed. The passing of Elijah's cloak to Elisha is a powerful reminder of God's faithfulness in sustaining and guiding his people through generations, using faithful servants to fulfill his redemptive purposes. Elijah often found himself alone in his fight against idolatry in Israel. "I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets." 1 Kings 18:22. This reality highlights the loneliness that sometimes accompanies faithful leadership, especially when standing for truth in a culture of disbelief and opposition. Elijah's willingness to stand alone against the corruption and idolatry of his time, challenging kings and facing false prophets, reflects leadership that springs not from human strength, but from deep divine conviction. Elijah's leadership reminds us that speaking difficult truths and defending divine principles can be a lonely path, but it is also a powerful testimony to God's presence and providence. Elijah's loneliness was not a sign of abandonment, but of a unique and deep relationship with God, who sustained him, guided him, and gave him courage. The conclusion of Elijah's earthly mission is marked by one of the most extraordinary events in the Bible, his ascension to heaven in a whirlwind. As they were walking along and talking together, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. 2 Kings 2:11. This moment not only signals divine approval and honor over Elijah's life and ministry, but also symbolizes his special status as God's prophet. Elijah's ascension to heaven is a powerful affirmation of the spiritual reality that transcends earthly existence, and a reminder that fidelity to God has eternal rewards. This unique event in biblical history reinforces the idea that a life dedicated to divine service is marked by a destiny that surpasses human and earthly limitations. Elijah's journey, full of divine victories and human challenges, offers us deep reflection on the duality of human existence in relation to the divine. Through his story, we are confronted with the undeniable fragility of humans, even among the most devoted servants of God, as well as the unchanging faithfulness of divine promises, a contrast that highlights the gracious and merciful nature of God in opposition to our own inconsistency. Elijah, despite being a powerful prophet and a man of deep faith, was not immune to the realities of physical and emotional exhaustion. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, I am no better than my ancestors." 1 Kings 19:4. This moment of despair from Elijah reveals that faith does not exempt God's servants from human struggles. Rather, faith coexists with our vulnerability, teaching us that dependence on God is not just a choice, but a necessity. The honesty with which Elijah expresses his discouragement before God shows us that our fragility does not distance us from God. On the contrary, it is in the admission of our weakness that we can experience God's strength, a truth echoed in Paul's words. "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." 2 Corinthians 12:9. Thus, human fragility, far from being an obstacle to faith, becomes fertile ground for an encounter with divine grace. God's response to Elijah's vulnerability is not of rebuke, but of provision, guidance, and renewal. God not only feeds and rests Elijah, but also meets him on Mount Horeb, reaffirming his presence and calling in the prophet's life through a gentle whisper, 1 Kings 19:12. This intimate encounter serves as a reminder of the divine promises of care, guidance, and constant presence, regardless of our ability to stand firm. God promises to be with us always, a promise that transcends circumstances and our understanding. "I will never leave you nor forsake you." Joshua 1:5. This divine faithfulness, demonstrated time and again throughout Scripture, highlights that even when we forget God's goodness and faithfulness, He remains unchanging, a beacon of hope and security amidst the inconstancy of the human condition. Elijah's story is a mirror of our own journey with God, reflecting the tensions between our human fragility and God's unchanging faithfulness. It teaches us that it's normal to feel exhausted and discouraged, but also reminds us that God is always present, ready to restore us with His strength, guidance, and love. Elijah's legacy invites us to embrace our humanity with honesty while trusting in divine promises, knowing that in our weaknesses, God's strength is made more fully manifest, guiding us through every challenge to a greater purpose and renewed hope. Like the video? Share it with someone very special in your life. Grace and peace.